Several years ago, the TV show Top Gear, the now deceased car show on the BBC, did a show, an hour-long show on the worst car ever made. They entitled it, "The Worst Car in the History of the World." They reviewed shoddily made cars from small manufacturers. They reviewed supercars that had shaky steering wheels, cars in which a man could feel his beard growing while the car went from 0 to 60. And so it went. They decided, though, that the worst car in the history of the world ever was a particular Lexus convertible. Not to offend anyone's taste or judgment here, of course. Why was this particular Lexus the worst car in the history of the world? Because in Top Gear's estimation, Lexus ought to have known better. Lexus had enough experience and prowess, enough engineering expertise, enough vision to not be the last manufacturer that had a tape deck come standard in one of their cars. They were good enough, or should have been good enough, to have a retractable roof that actually fit on the car properly, this sort of thing. They ought to have known better. They should have been wiser. These words in the book of Proverbs come to us in the first unit of the book, and they are probably a collected set of sayings from communal village life, indicative of common pieces of wisdom for the broader community during what was and is now known as the Persian period of occupation of the Holy Land, the era that was ushered in by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE. As time went by for the ancient kingdom, there was a desire to ensure that traditions, pieces of wisdom and culture were not lost in and among the hegemony of the Persians. And then as the Persian Empire began to stumble, the Greeks came along via Alexander the Great, and they began to dominate the region, giving Jews all the more reason to want to hold on to culture and tradition as empires came and went. The opening chapters of the book of Proverbs are about two women, a woman of wisdom and a woman of folly, which is a way of saying that the early parts of the book of Proverbs portrays a woman of Judaism and a woman of Persia. You do not get any gold stars for guessing which is which in this piece of Jewish wisdom biblical literature. One woman leads to life and one to death. One is wise, one is foolish. One is right, one is wrong. One entices young men to live in virtue, and the other leads to ruin. You understand. The woman of wisdom is strong and intelligent. She is architect and host, builder and baker. She is mature. Wisdom, also called prudence, is one of the cardinal virtues, along with justice, temperance, and courage, which come from Aquinas in part, who borrowed from Augustine in part, who borrowed from Ambrose, who borrowed from Cicero, who borrowed from Plato. And as Whitehead said, all of Western thought is a series of footnotes to Plato. So this thing called wisdom is not something that has been invented in recent times, but because wisdom is rooted in history, tradition, and experience, it is evolutionary. It changes. One of the best definitions for wisdom that I've heard is that it is a process for finding the truth while being coupled with the optimal process for executing the truth. It's about finding truth and then doing what you find. The book of Proverbs is then a set of sayings from a group of people who found themselves in what some might call a culture war. But an important note must be made that for them, for these Jews of the 5th and 6th century, their experience was based on actual wars, that led to an actual occupation. The book of Proverbs was composed during a time when Jews had that agonizing feeling that their culture was being slowly eroded by outside cultures or a dominant external force that was going to take a great effort to stop before their language, traditions, and ways of life were gone. Does this in any way sound familiar to contemporary discourse? The Bible, including Proverbs, is a text that is both progressive and at turns conservative because it seeks, literally, to preserve a culture. And the conservation of culture, boy, is that a tricky conversation. It is one that is constant in every culture today, I'm sure. What wisdom should be utilized in order to preserve, and what wisdom should be utilized in order to throw away? Because we all know in 2015, shift happens. How does one determine what's worth keeping, what's worth chucking? How do you control such a process? Anybody that has decided to do a yard sale as a married couple knows full well that yard sale preparation primarily consists of one person putting things on the lawn and the other person putting them back on the shelf. That is a conversation between two people who love each other. The woman of wisdom implores that the wise will love you when they are rebuked, presumably because the pursuit of wisdom involves constant correction. That is good for a person. It is good for a person to be turned away, turned down, and told that they are wrong. Oscar Wilde, I'm sure was correct if it was he that said that it is a friend that stabs you in the front. That the truest of bonds, the relationships that help us become wise, are based on course correction and appreciating that change in direction, being told, you're wrong. Which is odd then when we see how resistant the body of Christ can be to course correction. We increasingly find in 2015 that within religious circles it's not denominations that stand up against one another and pit, let's say, Congregationalists against Methodists, although I suppose that happens. But Presbyterians more and more argue primarily with Presbyterians. Methodists argue with Methodists in part because of the ways in which churches react to shift and the perceived or very real erosion of a particular kind of culture and history. Preserving culture. My goodness, what a strange turn we have seemingly taken then, when it is the department store Target that has become a scapegoat for such a conversation. Did any of you see this week the anger in certain corners aroused by Target's decision to stop applying the term boy or girl to toys at their stores? They are not changing those terms for clothes. You still have boys' clothes and girls' clothes. There will still be pink shirts in the girls section and blue pants in the boys section. As much as some of you might disagree with even that, Target is responding to the notion that girls enjoy playing with Lego, and I assume having more parents explore the entire toy aisle will probably mean good business for Target. The idea that a boy would sit down and use glitter on a craft project has got some folks worked up. Particularly Franklin Graham. Franklin, the son of Billy, took to Facebook this week and said, I think Target may be forgetting who has made their stores strong. It's not gender-neutral people. It's working American families, fathers and mothers with boys and girls that they love. What's next? Are they going to try and make people believe that pink or blue baby showers are politically incorrect? I have news for them and for everyone else. God created two different genders. Let Target know," this was to his fans and supporters and followers, "let Target know that you are perfectly willing to shop where the genders God created are appreciated." Now, it would be a piece of cake to stand here and smile or smirk or denounce. That is such a softball that any of us could hit that one out of the park with our eyes closed. It would be easy to try and get you to nod with something that I say that was something that ran contrary to what Franklin Graham said this week. To jump all in on the other side of the so-called culture war, which is most certainly not a war, and make someone that I do not know my own personal scapegoat. Or to put it another way, to play the exact same game just from the other side. What is ironic is that someone like Franklin Graham ought to know better. And the reason that he ought to know better is because I would argue that wisdom is having the ability to focus on important, truly important world events, things like actual wars rather than culture wars. I cannot abide the term war for debates in our culture in much the same way I increasingly can't stomach the terminology for action as in action movies, because action movies increasingly look more and more like a fantasy version of actual newsworthy events. In other words, we call a debate about gender-neutral toys a war, but we call the depiction of executions action, which is more than a little odd to me. So if we're talking about real wars and not fake wars, and we're talking real wars that result from real live violent action where people actually get hurt, Franklin Graham ought to know better, because his biggest and most important accomplishment is Samaritan's Purse, an enormous relief agency that is responsible for millions of dollars of aid all around the world. They have worked in the most dangerous of places with refugees and victims of all sorts of catastrophes, airlifting aid and supplies to the most remote corners of the world. While I certainly have issues with their approach, theology, and ideology, I cannot argue with their ability for a parachurch organization to meet emergency needs in real, live, actual places where war has occurred. To be wise in 2015, in my mind, is to focus on actual violence and its contributing factors, rather than using violent terminology to describe things that have nothing to do with war. A war on Christians in America in 2015 is not a war. A war on Christmas is most certainly not a war. A war on straight, white, economically prosperous males is not a war. There is always something ironic in the way that some Christians talk about being countercultural, but seem to have an obsession with socially constructed expressions of gender and then claiming war language whenever someone disagrees with that viewpoint. And now, you, the good people of Union Congregational Church, in you stride into this place in America. You, the good people of Union Congregational Church, try to do the right thing. Argue for the right thing. You try to be wise people in 2015, and boy, it sure feels like to be wise, to garner attention, to do the right thing and fight for the right thing is to respond in some capacity in kind to these larger conversations. How do you not fight fire with fire? We, at this point, ought to know better. We, at this point, ought to know that to be wise in our day is to be able to speak truth without the need to scapegoat somebody. That to be wise in our day is to figure out how not to return an eye for an eye. That to be wise in our day is to recognize that sometimes the person we want to criticize most viciously is simply an older version of ourselves. And concurrently, to be wise in our day is to make sure that not only are we offering forgiveness to others, but in so doing, we are willing to forgive ourselves for not having it all together 5 years ago. That some of the positions we most revile now are the same exact ones we used to hold ourselves. And so to let go of the anger we feel toward those with opposite points of view now is also to let go of the anger or guilt we feel about ourselves and our past views. To be wise in our day is also to refuse to give in to the temptation that human beings are one-dimensional. Franklin Graham is this week the author of words that either make my skin crawl or make me laugh because they are seemingly so completely ridiculous. And yet, I ought to know better. Philosophically, we are happy to yield to the wisdom that God doesn't make junk. That you and I, we are not creators of the universe, that things do not begin and end with us. We do not merely belong to ourselves, that we come to the altar for bread on a communion Sunday, and we come to the altar every time we break bread with another, seeking a different sort of wisdom. Wisdom in the book of Proverbs urges us to eat of her bread. What does that meal look like for you today? Peace be with you all.